Hello, everybody. This is Josh Kubicki, and I'm a legal modernist, and you're listening to the Legal Modernist podcast. All right, so this is a new experiment, if you will, for the Legal Modernist podcast. I'm Josh Kubicki. Going to do a quick episode, I don't know, it might be 15, 20 minutes, on how to think about practice group performance in law firms. We fall into some very bad habits when we think about what makes a really good practice group or a bad practice group or an underperforming practice group. And so I've spent some time lately talking to my students, law students, as well as first year associates at an AmLaw 50 firm, and also have talked about this over my years, both with senior equity partners, business of law leaders in law firms, and want to just take a moment to really sort of break down the texture of what goes into a practice group. And again, we tend to proclaim certain practice groups are more important or more successful. And all of that is, quite honestly, the way we talk about it, arbitrary. So let's break it down. So we know this, that law firms, performance not evenly distributed. We tend to talk about law firms and their AmLaw rankings and revenue. Sorry, my earbud keeps coming out. And we like lump everything together. Well, those of us who analyze and work with law firms and work with the leaders in the practice groups know that in any given law firm, there's some practice groups that are highly profitable. There are some practice groups that generate a lot of revenue, but maybe not profitable. There are some practice groups that are neither profitable nor revenue generating, but they bring certain clients into the firm that other practice groups can't get. Or we have practice groups that have a high amount of churn, so they don't keep clients. They serve one client and they move on to the next client. And then there's practice groups that have, clients that they just keep year over year over year, whether they grow them or not. So there's predictable revenue. Now, I just listed off 4 or 5 different elements of what goes into each practice group and how we measure performance. But I want to actually walk through a case study or two. So this really is about performance. It's not evenly distributed, and what I like to call why business business models matter. Quite honestly, my take is that practice groups are businesses. They are business models. They have all the texture, all the elements of a business model. And if we look at a practice group, I don't care if it's in the biggest firm or if it's a small practice group in terms of headcount or revenue, chances are it's got all the elements of business model. It just happens to be in a law firm. And so, it has a different operating model than your, donut stand or your, car wash or your CPA firm, right? Because it's part of a bigger organization. But we shouldn't confuse it with anything other than a business model. And when we look at the core elements of a business model, we see that the practices are, in fact, those. So why not analyze them as a business? Why not look at each practice as an individual business within a firm instead of trying to lump them together? They have different clients. They have different talent. They solve different problems for the market, and they perform differently. So let's take this. Let's see here. Let's bring this up on the full screen. I just want to give an example. These are some actual numbers. Obviously, I'm not going to disclose what firm they're from, but we basically have practice group A, B, and C. And at the top, you've got, top line revenue, and we've got billed revenue, and we've got contingent fee revenue, right? Some practice groups have a mix of both, and you can sort of see this. Well, if we looked at this and just added up the total revenue, we're going to see that practice group C is the winner, right? It's got the most revenue. Therefore, it must be the best because it's the biggest. It creates the most amount of dollars for the firm. And we see that practice group B is the smallest practice group, right? And how we would think about practice group A, B, and C, likely on first glance, we'd be saying, oh, practice group C is the most important to the firm because it drives the most amount of money. Here's the thing, that can be true or it can be wildly wrong. And in many cases, it is. So let's look as we start to break down the mechanics of the finance and what goes in to actually delivering the services and how we get paid for it and all the costs along the way. Let's see which practice group actually, at the end of the day, performs along different sort of metrics, if you will. Let's just jump back in here. So we got to minus the total expenses. So generally, when we're taking expenses out of revenue in a law firm, that is basically the direct expenses of the labor. So, like when we think about all of the associate salaries, any paralegals, any fee earners' salaries, not equity partners. We're going to put that aside. We're going to tackle that next. But any salaries and their associate hours and their hourly load for that salary, we would deduct that from the practice group, right? That's an expense. We got to pay the people to actually work and bill on the matter. So let's deduct the expenses and let's see, okay, well, practice group C has the most expenses. Not shocker, it's got the most revenue. So obviously most people are billing on it. Nothing really earth shattering here. So this is basically after expenses, we can see that group C is still the leader in terms of top line revenue with $72 million. Practice group B is still the laggard, if you will. Now let's look at compensation, partner compensation, right? So we know that partners have a certain compensation expectation yearly. We know that they are generally billing themselves. And so we have to take account of that. So don't get too caught up in indirect or direct partner compensation. Just notice that we have to take the partner compensation for all equity partners in that practice group out. Makes sense, right? We've got to pay the equity partners. We've paid the, you know, up above, we paid the associates and paralegals and of counsel and all that. Now it's time to pay the partners. So we can see that practice group C, we paid out roughly $66 million in comp to partners in practice group C and 22 million in practice group B. Again, nothing too earth shattering here. So let's look at our net. But we see a difference here. Look at this. Back up here, it looked all basically the same. We took roughly the same sort of ratio, if you will, out. But if you start doing all the math, which by the way, you guys don't have to do the math, we can see that the net income after partners compensation and after the expenses have been taken out, we can see that group C is now basically caught up with, or group B caught up with group C, right? So we started with group C that had all this top line revenue. And now we've got group B that was the lowest of top line revenue. And look at what's left after we take expenses and partner comp out. They're basically $1 million apart. Well, not even. They're 100. Yeah, $1 million apart. Group A has, I don't know, they've kind of fallen off a cliff here. But let's just stop right here for a second. Let's just think about this. So we had the highest group and the lowest group with revenue. And after taking expenses and partner comp out, they're basically dead even. So how many of us in our firms would think that the practice group that drives the least amount of revenue might be as quote unquote successful as the practice group that drives the most revenue? Not too many of us. And I can tell you from my experience working with a number of firms inside and as a consultant, if you're practice group B, generally speaking, most people are evaluating you based on your revenue number. And so you're not going to be the premier practice group. No one's going to want to talk about sort of net income or profitability, if you will, because we don't generally think of practice groups as being measured this way. So this kind of starts to show you that if we just do a little bit of math, if we do a little bit of analysis, we go a little bit further than just thinking about practice groups and revenue, we can get to a different layer and be like, okay, well, maybe these practice groups should be measured slightly differently. Maybe we should think differently about practice group B or practice group C now that we see some of the real numbers. Well, that's interesting, but we got more math to do, more counting to do, more adding and subtracting to do. Let's see where this goes. So the other thing that we do in firms, we should anyway, is we take account of how much revenue each practice group sends to other practice groups, right? So let's just break this down. So say I'm an IP partner and I've got some growing IP clients. They're growing in terms of their headcount. Sooner or later, they're going to have some employment law related challenges. And sooner or later, my client's going to say to me, listen, Josh, I know you're an IP lawyer. You don't do employment law, but we've got some issues we've got to, figure out. And I say, well, that's fantastic. In my firm, I've got an awesome employment partner. She's fantastic. Let me introduce you. And then my client starts sending her work. That's me. That's me in the practice group sending work to another practice group. So that's what this number is measuring. It's just saying how much work do you send, billable work, actual work, do you send to other practice groups? And we can kind of see the numbers here. Practice group A sends a lot. Practice group B, not so much, and practice group C, a little less than practice group A. Well, if we measure how much we send to other practice groups, then we have to measure how much other practice groups send to our practice group. Okay, so again, I'm the IP lawyer. I'm not working with a certain client, but my partner in, shall we say, M&A is, and their client is starting to have some IP concerns. Well, they're going to send that client, introduce me to the client, and I will more than likely, if I'm really good and can pitch the client, get IP work. So that partner sending work into my practice group. That's what this is measuring. So we can see the fee revenue received from other practice groups. Now, just looking at the numbers, I understand that you're probably not doing the calculations as we go through this. Let's see what sort of happens here. When we sort of look at how much we're sending versus how much we're receiving, there's a difference, and we call that the net fee revenue, right? In this firm, and I'll come back to this because this is different in different firms. In this firm, the strategy of the firm is to really sort of look at what we are sending to other practice groups as being more important, right? Because we're subtracting the fee revenue received from other practice groups from sent to. So like look at practice group B, they're in a deficit. That's what this is saying. They're in a hole $11 million, right? They get more from other practice groups than they give. Now, I will say this is where strategy in different firms differ. Many firms have a different take on this. Some don't measure this at all. They're not looking at how much they send. I mean, they may kind of anecdotally have a sense of it, but they're not actually tracking it to the dollar or to the hour. Other firms will reverse these. They want some practice groups to receive more than what they send. And this is probably going a little beyond the scope of this episode, but this is what we call sort of service practice groups. There's practice groups in some firms that really don't get their own clients. They don't go to market to get their own clients. They're basically there to service existing clients of other practice groups. And I'm not picking on any practice group in particular, but there's two that come to mind that can be more service practice groups and standalone, and that is immigration or trust in the states, where those teams might be doing individual or family or group work based on the needs of clients that are working with other practice groups. They're not actually actively selling those services to the market as a whole. And that's at a number of AmLaw 200 firms have those sort of service practice groups. So the point is, this is another delineation of firm strategy where you, by looking at the numbers and understanding what they track, can see, okay, what is important to them? What is a high performing practice group? What is not? And in this one, they're saying, well, what's more important is that you receive work from other practice groups versus what you send, or actually, sorry, other way around. What you send to other practice groups is more important than what you get from other practice groups, right? So this firm, you would say, has a very deliberate strategy on the infamous cross-selling because they're really trying to make sure that each practice group is getting as many contacts with one client as possible. So we see here, if we go back to the numbers, that wow, there is a lot going on here, and we see that if we do the adjustment, basically, practice group C is not looking as good. Practice group B is in the hole when it comes to sending work out, and practice group A is looking really good. But now we've done 3 cuts at this. We've done expenses, we've done partner compensation, and now we're looking at service mix and client mix across practice group. That's 3 different dimensions of measuring practice group performance. So let's look at the final numbers. And we can see after everything's said and done, basically practice group C is generating $5.8 million in profit or net income, practice group B 3.4, and practice group A almost 4. Look at those ratios at the bottom. What this tells us is basically practice group B is the most profitable. It is absolutely generating more profit than, and in terms of ratio, not necessarily dollars, but basically for every dollar that it spends, okay, it's making more money for the firm than another dollar being spent in either practice group A or practice group C. So what began with what we thought was practice group C, the biggest, the baddest, the best, the meanest, it had the biggest number, we can see that actually it's not the most profitable. It costs us more money as a firm to operate practice group C than it costs us to operate practice group B by basically 1.5%, which does add up when you're talking millions of dollars. So again, this is all about sort of practice group performance, but I want to take it one step further here and break down an actual case study. And let's look at employment, labor and employment. Now, this is a very interesting practice area to look into. It is definitely still somewhat separated, bifurcated in the market. There's lots of partners that are practicing, I really should say employment, because that's where I'm going to focus more than on labor. Practicing employment law in sort of a very traditional way, a billable hour way, one-off cases. Yes, they have clients and all that, but they're not really doing anything different than they have over the last 20, 30 years. But in employment litigation, there is more and more pressure from clients. There's high volume. This has been going on for decades, and some firms I'll talk about here in a minute have already accounted for the changes in the practice and have answered with a very specific strategy. And this is going to sort of follow on nicely from what we just talked about. So one thing I want to hit on here, again, no disrespect to any practice. All practices are doing great client service. This is not just hyperbole and me trying to be polite. It's true. There's a lot of client needs out there. And if a firm has lawyers and they're billing clients for it, my guess is clients are finding value in it. Okay. So it's very easy to pick on practice groups and all that. I don't buy into that at all. So what I'm going to say here is that in some firms, employment lawyers are viewed as different than, say, M&A lawyers. And you can read into the word different any way you want. I'm not going to get into it. But it's unfortunate because employment lawyers have something that a lot of other practice groups absolutely would crave. And if you looked at just the financials, right? If you just looked at their revenue and profitability, it wouldn't look like a high performing practice group, right? There's other ways to look at practice groups. So let's look at this. Now, this is some dated data from 2016, courtesy of my colleague and friend Bill Henderson. But basically, this demonstrates that in 2016, if we look at what's being shown here, those firms, out of all the AmLaw 200 firms that actively represented some of America's biggest companies, it's no coincidence that labor and employment firms are on this list and at the very top. Look at that. Littler Mendelson, Ogletree, Morgan Lewis. Now, Morgan Lewis is a multidisciplinary firm, but they have very strong labor and employment practice. Same with Seyfarth Shaw, right? Look at how many relationships they have with, basically, think of it as the Fortune 500. Think about that. So you have an employment practice firm that may not be the biggest in terms of revenue. They're, quite honestly, a lot of clients, the bigger clients, are putting their outside counsel under immense pressure for flat fees that are very aggressive, like talking like from answering a complaint to motion for summary judgment for sub $150,000. Very aggressive. it's required firms that want that business to do different things in how they staff them, how they use technology, their process, and all that. And you could say, well, why would we want that as a practice in our firm? It's bringing us down. It sucks our profitability. It's changing our business model. These employment lawyers want us to do things with our pricing that just don't fit with how we do business. They want us to use technology or document automation, and we don't really want that. And they're taking us down pathways that we don't want to go. Fair enough. But if you want the brands, if you want the logos, if you want the work of Fortune 500, having an employment practice that is successful brings a lot of those companies to the firm. I mean, look at this chart. These are big numbers bringing in the Fortune 500 to do business with your firm. If you're one of those firms that really thinks about how much a practice group sends work to other practice groups, like I just showed you in running through the finance, that employment partner is a key asset for the firm because they have a lot of key relationships with the big companies and they can introduce their other partners. So you don't see this on a financial spreadsheet necessarily. You don't know this unless you pay attention to the practice. And so this is one of those elements where the employment practice could be actually a main driver of a firm's growth, stability, success over the long term because they're bringing all these clients into the firm and introducing them to the partners. And just show you this again is just to kind of show you some of those firms and how they've grown. They're not shrinking. This takes us to 2017. If we rolled back or added the last 5 years, it wouldn't be much different. So going into employment law is not a bad bet. But look at what I added here. Each practice or firm has had to devise its own unique business model in order to compete in a hotly contested market. Employment law, getting those big clients, you've got to compete and you've got to come with something different. And if any of you know anything about Jackson Lewis or Littler or Seyfarth or Ogletree or Morgan, these are not known as the traditional law firms that are just laying back and saying, no, we've always done things this way. No, they're pushing the envelope with designing new business models to compete and win in the employment practice arena. They're the ones that are investing in new talent, new technology, new process, and new ways of thinking of delivering value to their clients. They have to, because that's how they win. They're competing with each other, right? And so each of these now, Littler and Jackson, they're more just L&E versus a Morgan Lewis and a Seyfarth. And I can tell you, if you're in a multidisciplinary firm like a Morgan Lewis or a Seyfarth, getting the permission from your partnership to act differently, think differently, operate differently as a practice group isn't easy. We know this. And so they've had to prove themselves time and time again. And I would argue that pushes them to excellence and that pushes them to really sort of have everything buttoned up. Again, they're going after a big market. They may not be making boatloads of money compared to some other practice groups. And you're winning top line revenue and profit and all those other things. But in terms of attracting those big brands and delivering value, and here's the final thing, because these practices have to compete, they're actually bringing in best practices for how we change certain practice groups. And I'll mention the innovation word. Having an employment practice, I'm just using employment. There's other practice groups that are in similar situations, unique context, but similar situations. They're the ones that are forcing the firms, asking the firm leadership to do different things. So there's just immense benefit across the board. All right, so hopefully this was useful, introduced you to the basic notion that we should not be measuring practice groups by just top line revenue. One thing I put up there for a recent conversation I had with lawyers was don't follow others' biases and assumptions, right? You're going to hear in your firm, oh, this practice group suck and wind, or this practice group is amazing. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Just know that generally speaking, we don't do even a next version of basic analysis in practice groups all too often inside law firms. So just check yourself before you sort of start judging other practice groups and understand what I said, that it's one thing to look at a number on a page. It's another thing to actually understand the business model of a practice group, to understand what's actually happening, how they're delivering value, what value actually means to their clients, what their operational model is, what kind of staffing and talent and tech and process they're using. It's very different, and it's getting more and more different each year that passes. The distance between practice groups being similar is actually growing. They're becoming more dissimilar over time. 10 years ago, practice groups in any firm looked and operated and felt much more the same than they do today. And that trajectory and that pace of distancing from another is only accelerating. So the more you understand, the more we understand how to measure practice group performance, at least the next level of it, some of the stuff I showed you today, we're going to have better questions. We're going to have smarter questions when it comes to practice group performance. We're not going to just rely on other people's biases and assumption as to what makes a good practice group and what doesn't. And we're basically going to be able to operate our practice groups a little bit better, because we're going to have a greater understanding of their needs, of their opportunities, and the recipes for success. So like I said, I wanted to basically share this with you all. I've been sharing this over the years. Just did it recently at my law school, the Richmond School of Law, where I teach on the business of law. And then I have 20-ish first years going through a 90-day challenge with me at an AmLaw 50 firm, where we're breaking down the business model of the law firm. We're now on the practice group, and we're going to end by teaching them how to break down the business model of a client. So really fascinating work, and I thought I'd take an opportunity to share this with all you. Hopefully it makes some sense. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you, or any comments as well. And again, this is my first attempt at LinkedIn Live. So hopefully I didn't embarrass myself. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, this has been the Legal Modernist podcast, live edition, and I will talk to you guys all soon.